On to Second Thessalonians chapter 1. We are back in Second Thessalonians chapter 1. We're going to pick up in verse 3 this morning where we are. But before we get anywhere, let me have us rehearse here for just a moment our memory verse. Our memory verse for the month of September is Second Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 15. Therefore, brethren, stand fast and hold the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or our epistle. Stand fast. Hold the traditions. Very important. Those who study religious demographics and culture assure us that we are in an era where the church is shrinking. The estimates range in dramatic and fatalistic detail. But that's the official estimate, that the church is shrinking, that churches are closing, that resources to churches are less and less and less. And of course, as we look around, we're a small church, so I don't know that we have felt that maybe as much as some people. But have you ever driven by a place that either, is a church that's closed, or it as a place where there used to be a church? You have any of those places? I'm thinking of one over in Bellingham, right off Rentham Road, that used to be a church, and then now it used to be a Walgreens too, because it used to be there. But churches are closing all over the place, and churches are shrinking all over the place, and there are less, pastors than ever before, and there are less people interested than ever before. And the predictions that go along with these observations, which the observations are just that. They are observations, and they're true insofar as they go, is that the kind of the way that we interpret that, though, is one of two different ways. The first way, and it's the more dire way, and a lot of people are doing it, they're looking at it and they're saying Christianity is dying. That all of these churches closing and all of these resources going away and all of these people walking out of the churches indicate that Christianity is in the process of dying. Now, I personally think that's a little dire. The other way that people are taking it, and I think it's probably a better way to be looking at it, is that the true church is fine. But that there are a lot of people who are practicing Christianity but aren't actually Christians. As we would define a Christian, we would define a Christian not as a cultural group, but as a person who has received Jesus as their Savior. They've been born again. They are a new creation in Christ, and they gather together in churches. That's how I define actual Christianity. You are a Christian if you've been born again, if you have been saved, if you are in relationship with God because of what Jesus has done for you. If those things are true, then you are a Christian by my maybe myopic definition. But churches are made up of Christians. But there are a lot of people who practice Christianity as a religion, as a philosophy, as a, whatever, and they're leaving. And so people who practice Christianity may be leaving the practice, but actual Christianity is quite fine. The true church, made up of true believers, is not impacted by what's going on in the broader culture. Now, we may not be growing as rapidly, but the fact that churches are closing, the fact that people are leaving and there's fewer resources, I don't believe it is a matter of life and death. It's not a matter of, Christianity is dying and we've only ever been one generation away from extinction anyway. If we fail to pass on our faith, we're not going to be here in the next generation or two. But I really don't think it's as dire as those who study culture would necessarily paint it. But whichever way you personally take these observations, we cannot help but notice that modern culture is increasingly hostile toward the Bible and Christianity. I mean, that much we sense and we see all of the time. That there is definitely an anti-Christian agenda at work in our world today, and it has been gathering steam, and it's just there. We can't miss it. We can't argue with it. But historically, that's not the exception. That's more of the rule. Historically, if we were to go back to the early church, we would find that the early church was running already then counter to their own culture. They were not popular. There was an anti-Christian bent and action going on in the first century. The church at Thessalonica existed in a time and in a place where it wasn't popular to worship God, where it wasn't popular to be saved, where it wasn't popular to talk about Jesus as king, because in the city of Thessalonica, who was king? Caesar was king. And to say that Jesus was king was, it was not just heresy, although Caesar had his own cult too. It was worse. And so the church at Thessalonica understood what it was to go through adversity. They understood what it was to go through life believing in Jesus, having a set of beliefs and a set of values and a set of core philosophies that they lived from that was not appreciated by the world around them and then was attacked by the world around them, just kind of like we are today. The first century and the 21st century have a lot of parallels. And so the early church faced that as well. And we find that as Paul addressed here, 2 Thessalonians addressed the church at Thessalonica, he addressed them with an awareness of the struggles that they faced. I want to begin in verse 3. And as we begin in verse 3, we find, first of all, that Paul was thankful for the church at Thessalonica. And all of these things, as we look at them, were really designed to be an encouragement to them. It's easy to browbeat people. It's easy to make people feel guilty and tell people how bad a job they're doing. Most of us need zero help in those departments, though, don't we? I don't need anybody to apply pressure to me to tell me I'm not perfect. I've got that covered. Don't you? What I sometimes need is somebody to tell me, hey, good job. You're doing good. I appreciate you. I love you. And in case you hear nothing else this morning, understand, I do appreciate you, and I do love you. And the Apostle Paul was taking that same tone with the church there. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 3. He said, we are bound to thank God always for you, brethren, as it is fitting, because your faith grows exceedingly, and the love of every one of you all abounds toward each other. It's interesting that Paul said that thankfulness was owed. It was something that he was bound to do. It was something that he owed as he looked at the church and he looked at his time with the church, although it was brief. He felt that he owed it to them to be thankful. He was bound. And that it was perfectly appropriate, perfectly fitting that he would be thankful. This was something that as he looked at it, it was the natural way that he thought that he should look at it. And then his thankfulness was based on his own observations of them. As he looked at the church at Thessalonica, as he looked granted from afar, as he received reports from his staff, as it were, who were going back and forth to the city of Thessalonica, who were working with the church there, he was hearing what was going on, and based upon the reports and the observations that he made, he was thankful. He was thankful because he could see that their faith grew exceedingly. Now let me stop here and ask you a question. A very important question. I'm really, really hoping you know the answer. So put your thinking caps on tight. What is faith? Faith is belief. See, this is going to keep coming up. The word faith is used a lot through the New Testament. It's important to know what faith is. And now that you do, you have windows of understanding that open all over the place. Faith is believing God. And he looked at them and he could see that their faith was growing increasingly. Now, does that strike you as odd that our belief in God would grow? Or does that strike you as kind of a normal thing? I'm hoping it strikes you as normal, because if you just, you got saved and all of a sudden you were super Christian, then I need to come sit where you are and you need to come stand where I am. Because most of us, that's not our experience. Most of us, after we get saved, we begin walking with the Lord and we begin going through circumstances and he helps us, and our faith, every time we have a little victory, our faith grows. Every time we have a win, our faith grows. Every time we see God
do something in our lives, our faith grows. Every time God moves and we're aware of it, our faith grows. And so our faith, the belief that we have in God is something that should be growing. I believe God. And that what I believe should continue to expand. As Paul was looking here at the church at Thessalonica, he said, your faith isn't just growing, your faith is growing exceedingly. It's growing exponentially. They were experiencing major wins, major victories, major faith-shaping events in their life. Even though they were going through hardship, as we'll look at in just a minute, their faith was growing. And Paul was thankful for that because he could see the fact that they believed God and the behavior that flowed from it was just continually increasing. Our faith should be growing. And then, not only was their faith growing and increasing, but their love internally abounded. He said, I can see and I hear from you that the love that you have for each other abounds. It's growing exponentially as well. There is a deepening bond of unity and love and self-sacrifice that I am witnessing and that I am hearing about with you. It's interesting. The word love here is this Greek word agape. And there are many words, like any language. We have lots of different words for love. We have like, love, lust, all these different things. The Greek had the same ideas. Excuse me. The word agape in Greek language and culture in Paul's day, in the early church, was actually a Greek word that was not defined and not used very often. It was kind of one of those, it means love, but we haven't really isolated what it means about love. And so the church grabbed this word out of the Greek language and they said, we're going to infuse meaning into this word. And so they took this word agape and they assigned it the meaning of a God-like love. Agape is how they define the love that God has for us. That full love, that unfettered love, that love that risks and sacrifices and gives everything, expecting nothing in return. That selfless love that God has for us. And they infuse that meaning into the word. And then Paul uses it here in this context that they had agape for each other. That they loved each other selflessly, that they loved each other deeply and passionately and without reservation and without expectation of receiving anything back. And Paul says, I see this and I see this abounding in your church, and I am thankful because of what I see. Now, agape love is one of those interesting kind of things because as believers, it's the kind of love that we actually receive the capacity to extend from God. It's the love that God shows to us that we show to others as we experience it. We are able to then extend it. And so he says to the church there, so you have the fact that their faith was growing and their love was abounding. There's a sympathetic relationship between those two things. As they believed God more and experienced God more, they were able to extend God more to other people. So Paul, as he's witnessing this, is very grateful for that. And so Paul was grateful for them. And then we find in verse 4 that Paul was boastful about them. Observing all of these things, he goes on in verse 4, and he says, so that we ourselves boast of you among the churches of God for your patience and faith in all your persecution and tribulations that you endure. He says, as I look at you and as I travel around the world, he says, I hold you up as a model for other churches. That's impressive. How old was this church? Not very. How long was Paul there? Less than a month. I mean, this is a church that had, a lot of things going against them, and yet they were flourishing. And the apostle, to the point where Paul says, I hold you up as a model for other churches. What was it that they modeled? He says they modeled patience and faith. These are the two great things that the apostle Paul looked at them and said, you model these two things so well that I talk about you everywhere I go. Well, patience and faith. What is patience? Patience literally means remaining under. If you want to think of it in those terms, that's what it means. The idea is that a heavy load is placed on our back. And when a heavy load is placed on your back, you're confronted with a choice. The choice is you can take it off and get out from underneath it, or you can remain under it. And he says, you have had this heavy load placed upon you, and you remain under it. You have the strength to carry the load that has been placed upon you. That's the patience that Paul was talking about. They were facing a lot of things that weighed upon them, but they carried it well. They carried it with strength. They carried it with vigor. How many of you have ever carried like a really heavy backpack? You know, you put too many books in your backpack. Kids, do they still carry books to school? I don't know. Too many iPads in your backpack. I don't know. You carry too many books. Books are those hard things with words inside, you know. But you carry too many books in your backpack, and it gets heavy. You start, you know, if you're going hiking, and suddenly you're like, okay, if I'm going hiking, I need water. Water's not a bad idea. How much does water weigh? Anybody know? 8 pounds to the gallon. So in case you're playing Trivial Pursuit and you need that, that's why I know it. 8 pounds. So if you're like, I'm going to be hiking, I'm going to be sweating, I need water, I'm going to need, you know, several things of water. I'm going to pack those in. You know, you get a gallon of water, that's 8 pounds. You're going to need some food. You're going to need an umbrella or a raincoat. It's not hard if you're going for a hike for your backpack to fill up quickly. And if you're a parent, it's worse. Because all of a sudden now you're carrying their water and their raincoats and their whatever, so, you know, along the way. You put on a heavy backpack and it can be hard to carry. It begins to slump you over a little bit. So he said to the church there, you have patience. You carry under, you remain under this weight, and you do it well. And he said, not only do you have patience, you have faith. What is faith? He keeps using this word, and we actually know what it means. Isn't that exciting? You spent the entire summer so that you know what the word faith means. It's awesome. Faith is believing God. Don't let that definition get old. Let it really take hold. So he says, look, you have patience and you have faith. You model that, and I talk about that. But not only did they have patience and faith, he said that they endured persecution and tribulation. And this is where it begins to get kind of that real and gritty thing going on. Persecution and tribulation. These were the heavy load that they were carrying. This is the weight that had been placed upon them that they were remaining under. Persecution and tribulation. Now, persecution is external difficulties for our faith. That's the way, bless you, we can think of persecution that way. Persecution is external difficulties for our faith. Now, here's the thing about persecution, though. It's not what I'll call punitive. It's not to punish you for your faith. Persecution has a design, and the design of persecution is to rehabilitate you. It's trying to rehabilitate you back to your fallen state. In the world's eyes, we're an aberration, and we need to be rehabilitated. They would go nuts if we tried to rehabilitate anybody else for anything else, though that's kind of the deal. But persecution isn't to punish you for your faith. It's to get you to dump your faith and get back to normal life, as they define it. So it's this external difficulties that you face designed to get you to drop your faith and join the rest of society in their whatever. That's persecution. Now, tribulation is different. Tribulation is a pressure or a pressing, and it's something that especially burdens the spirit. This is more of an internal reaction to the persecution we're facing. It's an internal reaction. It's a spiritual reaction to the pressure that we face. And it literally, the word means oppressing or a pressure. If I were to say the name to you of Giles Corey, how many of you would know that name?
Giles Corey lived and died 326 years ago this week in the state of Massachusetts. And he is unique in all of American history and all of American jurisprudence. Giles Corey, on April the 16th of 1692, at the age of 81 years old, was arrested and charged with witchcraft. Giles Corey lived in what is today Peabody, but back then was a village outlying of Salem, Massachusetts. Giles Corey was advised of the charges against him and encouraged to enter a plea. He refused. He would not say that he was guilty or innocent. He refused to enter a plea. Under common law at the time, a person who did not enter a plea could not be tried. Now today they just enter a plea for you, but in that day, if you refused to enter a plea of either guilty or innocent, you could not be tried. It was just kind of one of the nuances of the law. But to make sure that, everybody didn't just fail to enter a plea, the law gave the courts the capacity to invoke torture to induce a plea. And the specific torture that was permitted and prescribed under law was a torture called pressing. Now, pressing, the way it was done is the person to be pressed would literally be stripped naked in public, would be laid on the ground, they would place a heavy board on him, and then they would begin to pile up heavy rocks on the person, especially on their torso and their chest area. The design of this torture was to get you to agree to enter a plea. And they would continue to add weight, and there was prescriptions about how it was to be done, but they would continue to add weight until you finally broke and entered a plea. In Giles Corey's case, he was actually, this went on for a couple of days. They kept piling the rocks on, and a couple times a day, the sheriff himself would actually climb up on top of the rocks that were on top of him and try to get him to acknowledge the charges that were made against him and enter a plea. And Giles Corey's response is priceless, because every time as he was laying there underneath this board, underneath these rocks, underneath all this weight, every time they asked him, enter a plea, he simply said two words: more weight. More weight. Not going to enter plea. More weight. And so they added more weight. They obliged him. They added more weight. After 2 days, as an 81-year-old man, not the most robust, youthful, healthy guy, it comes as no real surprise that it was September the 19th, 1692, Giles Corey died by pressing, having never entered a plea. He knew what it was to be pressed, and this word is a lot like that. I think of Giles Corey's story, and you think about the era in which this took place. What were his options? He could and did die of pressing, but if you think about it, if he'd entered a plea of guilty, what was going to happen? They would take off the rocks, they would put up a rope, and they'd hang him. So he could die by pressing. If he pled guilty, he could die by hanging. It's faster, but the net effect is kind of the same. What would happen if he pled innocent to the charges? He would be tried. How many people were cleared in the witchcraft trials? None. So if he pled innocent, they'd take him to court, and then they'd take him to the tree and hang him. So he was either going to die, he was going to die, or he was going to die. That was pretty much his options. That's really not great options to choose from. Would you agree with that? But if he pled guilty, he'd be guilty of witchcraft. Everything he owned would be forfeit to the state. If he pled innocent and was found guilty, everything he owned would be forfeit to the state. But because he didn't plea at all, there was no trial, and his whole inheritance was passed to his sons-in-law pursuant to his will, because it wasn't forfeit to the state. He was not guilty. There was no trial. The state couldn't seize his assets. He couldn't choose whether or not to die in this situation. He was going to die. He could only choose how he was going to die and what the consequences of that death would be. It's an amazing story that this guy in this setting had the wherewithal, the fortitude, and maybe the rebellious streak enough to say, more weight. Because the instinct, and the reason that the torture was designed the way it was, is because the instinct of the human under that kind of pressure is, I'll say anything, just get it off. I can't breathe, I can't swallow, I can't, literally eyes bulging, mouth, tongue bulging out. I mean, it's grotesque. And we instinctively want that to end, and we don't think far enough that there's a hangman's noose right behind it. But he had the wherewithal under the pressing to remain. He had the wherewithal under the pressing to say more weight. It's the same with us. As Christians, as real Christians, as those who have been born again, can I tell you that there is no way to be unborn? Does that make sense to you? You ever seen a baby be unborn? No, it's kind of a one-way street, right? You're born, and that's any ladies in here going to volunteer to take that back? The same way it came out? And then we'll do it again later. You cannot be unborn. You can die, but that's a very different thing, isn't it? You can't be unborn. It wasn't an accident that Jesus in John chapter 3 described salvation as being born again. It is a life-altering event. It is a precipice that you walk across and cannot come back through. When we are born again, we cannot be unborn. We simply are who we are. As a Christian, there is no place to quit to. There is no way to quit. You simply are as you are. Now, if you are practicing Christianity and not an actual Christian, you can quit. Can't you? You just walk away. It's not really who you are. It's just something you do. And if it's something you do, you can stop doing it. But you can't stop being it if it's you. You understand the distinction, yes? So Paul here was talking to people who were being pressed, being persecuted from the outside, who were being pressed spiritually from the inside, but who had no place to go, who faced pressure that they could not escape because they could not cease being who they were. They couldn't be unborn. You can't renounce faith if it is who you are. It's what you do, fight quick. And so Paul then moves in the last 5 verses here of our text, verses 5 through 10, already encouraging them, but really takes this very specific bent to encourage them. And he encourages them in a number of different ways. The first way is the encouragement of righteous judgment. He says this in verse 5, and I know we need to hurry. He said in verse 5, which is manifest evidence of the righteous judgment of God, that you may be counted worthy of the kingdom of God for which you also suffer. Their endurance was the visible proof. It was the manifest evidence of God's righteous judgment. Now, when we hear those terms, God's righteous judgment, we instinctively think that judgment is punishment, right? You hear that? God's righteous judgment, God's righteous punishment. If I were to say it that way, we wouldn't blanch at all, would we? Because there's just that part of us that hears judgment and thinks punishment. That's not the case here. The word that's translated judgment doesn't mean punishment here. There are times it does. Different words. But the underlying word, the word that's translated here, actually speaks to the act of investigating, the process of distinguishing or separating what is something and what is something else. It's not God standing in judgment over us as a judge, but rather it is God making a judgment of what we are, of who we are, Him observing us. And so the Apostle Paul says that the pressure that we face, the faith and the patience that we manifest in the face of this persecution and trial it's the visible proof that even God can see
And God can make a judgment that we really are believers. And it's something that the rest of the world can see, that we really are who we say we are because of the righteous judgment of God. Not that He's punishing us or judging us, but He deems us righteous because of what He views in us, what He sees us enduring for Him. And so you think about it, and maybe it's a little esoteric to some of you, but when you think about it, is it encouraging to think that when God looks at me, He views me as righteous? Is that encouraging that God would look at you and say, right on, you got it right? I find that encouraging because so many times when I think how God thinks of me, and this is how I'm thinking that God's looking at me going, you are a mess, son. But that's me thinking of what God thinks of me. That's not what God thinks when God thinks of me. When God looks at me and He sees the endurance that I have to use, to go through, to endure all that goes on around, He looks at me and He doesn't see the mess. He looks at me and says, good job. You're doing it right. You know, it's like a kid hitting a nail. They hit it once or twice out of 5. The nail's kind of bent over, and it might go in, it might not. You got to kind of straighten it out and help them out a little bit. But as a dad, what do you say to your kid? Good job. You actually hit the nail. You bent it. I can't use it anymore, but you hit it. Right? That's God. Man, you made a mess of that, but that's awesome. You tried. Is it encouraging to think that God doesn't look at you with judgment and punishment? But He looks at you and says, good job, keep trying, keep going. That's my boy, that's my girl, those are my children, look at them go. Perfect? No, but man, they try hard. Is that a different way to view God? Or a different way to think about how God views us? That's encouraging. Be encouraged by God's righteous judgment. And He goes on, the encouragement of righteous vengeance. And he's going to go on, and I'm going to kind of skip this. You can read it. It's verse 6, it's verses 8, 9, and 10. One of these days, God is going to be, He is going to issue a butt whooping. And it's not to us. One of these days, vengeance will be doled out. But it won't be doled out on His children. It'll be doled out on those who persecuted His children. And there is a bit of a comfort in knowing that those who torment you will one day get their comeuppance. That they will one day be tormented themselves. And it's not even wrong to look forward to that day. Because we place their revenge, their comeuppance, at the one who is able to rightly and justly and perfectly dole it out. God always said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Of all of the things that God has given us, we thirst for vengeance, and He has always said, no, that is mine. Why? Because God alone knows the human heart. God alone knows all the facts. God alone knows what measure of vengeance is necessary and appropriate. And God alone knows how to exact it best. And so He has always said, this is mine. Don't go here. So the next time you're tempted to avenge yourself, remember, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. You step upon a divine prerogative when you step up to administer vengeance. That goes for little kids. That goes for not so little kids. All the same. But one of these days, God is going to execute vengeance upon those who torment His children. We can be encouraged in that, and it's not even wrong. Isn't that awesome? God's going to get you, but I'm just going to love you. Let it roll. Lastly, we get the encouragement of rest for the righteous. Let me read this for you. Verse 7. And to give you who are troubled rest with us when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with His mighty angels. Whatever else we may face in this life, one of these days we are going to receive rest. Had a busy week this week? I did.
Seems like they keep getting busier, doesn't it? Seems like the pressure keeps increasing. And when it's not the world adding it, I manage to add some of my own. The idea of rest sounds increasingly nice. I'm thinking another hour or so, I'm going to go take a nap. I like the idea of rest. You say, is church ever going to end? I assure you it will. I have an appointment with my bed. I like the idea. I remember as a kid, it was punishment. Go take a nap. You're like, I don't want to take a nap. Now you're like, could somebody punish me? I need to go take a nap. One of these days, there is a rest that we will enter into, that we will exist in. That just sounds nice. It's like living in a hot tub. I really couldn't think of anything better. We enter into rest. You see, the believers in Thessalonica faced a difficult task. With little instruction, they needed to remain faithful in the face of increasing pressure. To know that Paul, their spiritual father, was grateful for them, proud of them, and encouraging to them was important. We all need encouragement from time to time. And that's why it's really important, probably the most important thing that we can see here is what is the source of their encouragement? It wasn't really Paul. Paul was thankful to God for them. He was boastful before God for them. He encouraged them in God and what God was doing. See, Paul isn't here today. And I can encourage you and I can boast about you and I can be proud of you and I am all of these things. It's not quite the same. Because really their source of encouragement wasn't Paul. It was God. Paul is not here. I may not always be here, but God is always here. God is always near. To know that He looks down on us as we face trouble for His name, and He recognizes us as righteous is encouraging to us. To know that He will avenge us is encouraging to us. To know that He will provide a rest for us is encouraging to us. To know that He has provided people who love us and support us through adversity is encouraging to us. The goal of this particular part of Paul's letter was to encourage the believers in Thessalonica. The goal of my message to you today is exactly the same. Be encouraged. We're going to have adversity. We're going to have struggle. We're going to know pressure. But God will see us through, and we will only ever be better for it. Are you really a Christian today? Or do you just practice Christianity? It makes a difference how you answer that question. It makes a difference that you define Christian in the same way that I do. Not because of how I define it, but because of where I get my definition from, and that's the Bible. That's how the Bible defines a Christian. Only those who are born again can't quit. So are you really a Christian today, or are you just practicing Christianity? Because if you're just practicing Christianity, this time next year, you could be a statistic. You used to be. I talk to people all the time, oh, I used to go there. I used to be a Christian. No, there is no such thing. There is no used to be a Christian. If you were really a Christian, you still are. If you used to practice Christianity, you may have quit. Happens all the time. So are you really a Christian, or are you just practicing Christianity? It makes a difference, and some people don't understand the difference in their own lives. They marry the two as one thought, but they're not. It's important that you understand for yourself which you are doing and which you are. Secondly, are you enduring pressure? That answer should be almost self-obvious. I need to say, do you be encouraged? Would you stand with me? We'll not sing. I'm hot, you're hot, we're all tired. Stand together. We'll pray and then we'll head out. Father, we love you. I thank you for this text. Lord, I thank you for the Apostle Paul and for the encouragement that he sought to give to the church at Thessalonica. and that he wrote down so that we could be encouraged ourselves. Father, I would ask you this morning that your Spirit would speak to each of us in this moment, the quiet of our own hearts, would help us to distinguish for ourselves where we really are spiritually. There are a lot of people in churches this morning across America, across the world, who are practicing Christians, but who really aren't Christians. Father, I ask that your Spirit would shine a light in this room, in these hearts, and illuminate for us if we are just practicing Christianity. And Lord, you would take us that last step. Draw us to yourself so that we might be real Christians. We might be born again. So that there would be no turning back. And then, Father, I pray for those who are facing pressure today, this week. Really, that's probably all of us. Father, I would ask that you would encourage us and help us to receive encouragement and be encouraged for the pressures that we face. Lord, we think about the wins that we've celebrated. We think about the losses that we've endured. We think about the challenges that we faced this week. Would you help those challenges to be wins as we're encouraged and we continue to walk through the doors that you open for us? Help us to serve you well, knowing that you love us, and that you accept us, and that you're proud of us, and that you want to encourage us in our walk. Help us, we pray, Father, in Jesus' name.